It is 3 o'clock in the morning on October 3rd, 1943, and Major Rau of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division is asleep in his pyjamas in a requisitioned house in Termoli. The Adriatic port is quiet. His paratroopers, the elite of the Luftwaffe, veterans of Crete, North Africa, and Sicily, hold the town with the casual confidence of men who believe themselves the finest light infantry on earth. They have reason for that belief. The Fallschirmjäger have never been driven from a position by a force their own size. They have fought the Australians and New Zealanders on Crete, the Americans at Casino, and they have given as good as they got against every opponent the Allies have thrown at them. But Rau does not know that at this moment landing craft are grinding onto a sandbank 800 yards offshore, and that the men wading through the black surf carry Fairbairn Sykes fighting knives, Bren guns, and Thompson submachine guns. They are Royal Marine Commandos of number 40 RM Commando, and they are about to give the Fallschirmjäger the worst shock of their Italian campaign. Within 5 hours, Major Rau will be a prisoner of war, captured humiliatingly in his nightclothes. His paratroopers will be dead, scattered, or surrendering. German supply lorries will continue driving obliviously into Termoli throughout the morning, each one greeted by long Bren bursts from Royal Marine ambush positions until it runs off the road and overturns, often in flames. The Fallschirmjäger divisional commander, General Heydrich, will flee the town on foot, abandoning his staff car, a sleek 1939 Horch, which No. 3 Commando will gleefully commandeer. This was not an anomaly. From the landings in Sicily to the final, savage battle at Lake Comacchio in April 1945, the Royal Marine Commandos fought the Fallschirmjäger at closer quarters, with greater frequency and with more devastating results than any other Allied elite force in the Mediterranean theatre, including the US Army Rangers, whose catastrophic destruction at Cisterna in January 1944 remains one of America's most painful wartime memories. The Germans came to know the Green Berets by their aggression, their silence, their night fighting skills, and their unsettling willingness to close with the bayonet and the fighting knife when ammunition ran short. So, what made these men different? Why did the Green Berets inspire a particular dread among German paratroopers that Derby's Rangers, brave, superbly led, and trained partly by the British themselves, ultimately did not? The answer lies not in one battle, but in a lethal combination of training philosophy, tactical doctrine, institutional culture, and sheer, bloody-minded tenacity that traced its origins to the rain-lashed Scottish Highlands and the vision of one remarkable admiral. The full story begins in the darkest days of 1940, when Britain stood alone. By the summer of 1940, Britain's strategic position was, by any sober assessment, catastrophic. The British Expeditionary Force had been hurled from the continent at Dunkirk, leaving behind the bulk of its heavy equipment. France had capitulated. The Wehrmacht stood on the Channel coast. The Royal Navy was stretched thin across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Far East, and the threat of invasion was real enough that concrete pillboxes sprouted across the Sussex Downs and Kent orchards like a sudden crop of grey mushrooms. In Whitehall, the War Cabinet confronted a choice that shaped everything that followed. The instinct of the Chiefs of Staff was defensive: preserve forces, husband resources, prepare for the long war that might or might not be survivable. But Winston Churchill, newly installed at number 10, and animated by the ferocious combativeness that would define Britain's war, wanted something else entirely. He wanted attack. On June 4th, 1940, barely a week after the last boat left Dunkirk, Churchill fired off one of his characteristically pugnacious memos. Enterprises must be prepared with specially trained troops of the hunter class who can develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast. It was a typically Churchillian blend of the romantic and the ruthless. The idea of small, aggressive raiding forces was not new. The Boer commandos of 1899 to 1902 had pioneered such tactics against the British Army itself. But Churchill's directive gave the concept political backing at the highest level. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clarke, military assistant to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir John Dill, was tasked with translating Churchill's vision into organisational reality. Clarke proposed volunteer units drawn from existing army regiments trained for amphibious raiding behind enemy lines. The name he chose was deliberately borrowed from the Boers, Commandos. The first volunteers were assembled within weeks. They were a self-selecting group, men who answered a call for service of a hazardous nature. And they came from infantry regiments, the Royal Artillery, the Royal Engineers, and every corner of the army. But the early commandos were an army creation. The Royal Marines, Britain's oldest amphibious force, with a lineage stretching back to 1664, were initially absent from the picture. The Marines had their own battalions, their own traditions, and their own chain of command through the Admiralty. The idea of Marines serving under Army commando structures was, to many senior naval officers, faintly distasteful. Yet the logic was inescapable. If Britain was to create an elite amphibious raiding and assault capability, it was absurd to exclude the one branch of the armed forces whose entire institutional purpose was fighting from the sea. The man who forced the issue was Lord Louis Mountbatten, appointed Chief of Combined Operations in October 1941. Mountbatten was ambitious, politically astute, and determined to expand the commando force. The army, by then focused on building up conventional divisions for an eventual return to France, was reluctant to release more manpower. The Royal Navy wanted its Marines for coastal batteries and fleet duties. Mountbatten persisted. He argued, lobbied, and manoeuvred within Whitehall until he secured agreement for Royal Marine battalions to be reorganised and retrained as commandos. It was a bureaucratic victory with profound operational consequences, for the Marines who emerged from this process would prove themselves a breed apart. In February 1942, a signal went out to every Royal Marines unit and across the fleet. For the attention of all Royal Marine trained personnel, volunteers required for special duties of a hazardous nature. Over 6,000 men came forward. The selection process was brutal and deliberate. Only the best candidates proceeded to the next stage, the commando course at Achnacarry Castle in the rain-soaked Lochaber region of the Scottish Highlands. Achnacarry was the ancestral seat of Sir Donald Walter Cameron of Lochiel, chief of Clan Cameron, and it was about as far from the genteel comforts of a country house as wartime ingenuity could make it. The castle's green lawns had been ripped up and replaced with asphalt. Nissen huts sprawled across the grounds. The surrounding terrain, lochs, mountains, river gorges, and moorland became a vast outdoor laboratory for the science of close-quarters killing. The course was run by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, a man of formidable standards, and it lasted 6 punishing weeks. Recruits marched 7 miles from the Speen Bridge railway station carrying full kit before they even began. From that point, every day was an escalating test of physical endurance, mental resilience, and tactical skill. They trained with live ammunition. This was not a metaphor. Instructors fired over the heads of men on assault courses, detonated explosives beside them during river crossings, and used tracer rounds to simulate the reality of enemy fire. Men died in training at Achnacarry. Their graves, marked with wooden crosses near the castle, served as a silent admonishment to those who followed. The curriculum covered close-quarter combat, silent killing techniques taught by the legendary William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, amphibious and cliff assault, demolitions, survival, orienteering, small boat handling, and the use of every weapon in the Allied and Axis armories. Any man who failed to meet the standard was returned to his parent unit, the dreaded RTU, without ceremony or appeal. By late 1942, the 1st Royal Marine Commando, initially designated simply the Royal Marine Commando to distinguish it from the Army units, was operational. Its commanding officer was Colonel J. Picton Phillips. The unit's baptism of fire came at Dieppe on August 19, 1942, Operation Jubilee, a raid that was, by almost every measure, a blood-soaked disaster. But the Marines drew their own lessons from that catastrophe, lessons about fire support, beach obstacles, and the price of inadequate intelligence that would inform every subsequent operation. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Americans were building their own version of the British commando model. Colonel William O. Darby, a charismatic and aggressive officer from Arkansas, was tasked with forming the 1st Ranger Battalion in May 1942. Darby selected volunteers from the 34th Infantry Division and the 1st Armoured Division, then shipped them to Scotland for training under British commando instructors at Achnacarry. The Rangers were brave, fit, and enthusiastic. But the critical difference was institutional. Darby's Rangers were designed as a temporary wartime expedient, a provisional force that would be expanded, contracted, and eventually disbanded according to operational need. The Royal Marine Commandos, by contrast, were embedded within one of the oldest military institutions in the world. Their identity was not provisional. It was permanent, and it carried 3 centuries of amphibious tradition behind it. This distinction would matter enormously when both forces came face to face with the Fallschirmjäger in Italy. The Italian campaign was, from its inception, a theatre designed to grind men down. When the Allies landed in Sicily in July 1943, the Mediterranean strategy was already a source of fierce argument between London and Washington. Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff saw Italy as a way to knock a major Axis power out of the war and draw German divisions away from the Eastern Front and the future invasion of France. The Americans, Marshall, Eisenhower, and most of the US War Department regarded the Mediterranean as a strategic sideshow, a British imperial indulgence that diverted resources from the decisive cross-channel assault. The compromise was a campaign that was never quite given the resources it needed. Italy's terrain, mountainous, rain-drenched, bisected by rivers and narrow valleys, was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. The Germans, under the formidable Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, exploited every ridge, every river line, every stone-walled village, with the defensive tenacity for which the Wehrmacht was justly feared. And the finest of Kesselring's troops in Italy were the Fallschirmjäger. The 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, under General Lieutenant Richard Heydrich, was an extraordinary formation. Its men had been recruited for their physical fitness, aggression, and willingness to fight in isolation, precisely the qualities that airborne operations demanded. Though Hitler had forbidden large-scale parachute drops after the bloodbath on Crete in 1941. Where the Fallschirmjäger suffered over 4,000 casualties taking the island from Commonwealth defenders, the division remained operational as elite infantry. They fought with a distinctive combination of firepower and tactical flexibility built around the MG-42 machine gun, a weapon capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that individual shots blurred into a single terrifying rip of sound the Allies called Hitler's buzzsaw. By autumn 1943, the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division was deployed on the Adriatic sector of the Italian front, and it was here that they first encountered the Royal Marine Commandos in force. The occasion was Operation Devon, the amphibious assault on Termoli on October 3, 1943. The plan was Montgomery's, a seaborne flanking move to bypass the German defences along the Biferno River and seize the deep water port of Termoli, thereby enabling the 8th Army's advance up the Adriatic coast. The assault force was Brigadier Durnford-Slater's Special Service Brigade, No. 3 Commando, No. 40 Royal Marine Commando, and the Special Raiding Squadron, the renamed 1st SAS, under the redoubtable Paddy Mayne. Intelligence indicated a garrison of around 500 German paratroopers. The landing, in the small hours of that October morning, achieved total surprise. No. 3 Commando secured the bridgehead without the enemy even knowing they were ashore. No. 40 Royal Marine Commando, led by Lieutenant Colonel J.C. Manners, drove deep into the town in darkness and smashed into the sleeping Fallschirmjäger at close quarters. The fighting was room to room, knife and grenade, the sort of intimate violence for which Achnacarry had specifically prepared these men. By dawn, the town was theirs, and the reckoning with the Fallschirmjäger had only just begun. The capture of Termoli was swift, violent, and humiliating for the Germans, but what followed over the next 3 days was the real test. And it was here that the difference between the Royal Marine Commandos and other Allied elite units became starkly apparent. The Fallschirmjäger were furious. Heydrich, having fled in his slippers, immediately organized a counterattack. By October 5th, elements of the 16th Panzer Division and reinforcements from the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division were converging on Termoli with tanks, self-propelled guns, and fresh infantry. The commandos, lightly armed and without heavy armour of their own, were expected to hold until the 78th Infantry Division could land reinforcements by sea and push through overland. No. 40 Royal Marine Commando set ambushes on the northern approach roads. Throughout the morning and into the afternoon, German supply lorries continued driving into Termoli, unaware that the garrison had been overwhelmed. The Marines positioned Bren guns at a crossroads and destroyed 12 vehicles in succession, each one sprayed with automatic fire until it careened off the road or burst into flames. It was methodical, cold, and devastatingly efficient. When the Panzer counterattack came in earnest, the fighting was savage. German tanks rolled into the outskirts of the town, and the commandos fought them with PIAT anti-tank weapons, Hawkins grenades, and, when nothing else was available, raw nerve. The Marines had been trained to hold ground under conditions that would have broken less cohesive units. Their fire discipline was exceptional. They did not waste ammunition. They did not panic when armour appeared. They engaged at close range, fell back to prepared positions when necessary, and counterattacked when the opportunity arose. Contrast this with what happened to Derby's Rangers at Cisterna barely 4 months later, in January 1944. The Rangers were ordered to infiltrate 5 miles behind German lines along the Mussolini Canal to seize the crossroads town of Cisterna in advance of a general breakout from the Anzio beachhead. The plan was bold, precisely the sort of audacious, deep penetration mission for which the Rangers had been designed, but the intelligence was catastrophically wrong. American analysts had failed to detect a massive German build-up in the area, including elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division and Fallschirmjäger units. The 1st and 3rd Ranger battalions, some 767 men, moved in column along a drainage ditch through the darkness. At dawn, they were surrounded. German tanks, machine guns, and mortars tore into them from every direction. The Rangers fought with desperate courage. There is no questioning their bravery. But they were trapped, outgunned, and without the heavy weapons needed to break out. By the end of the day, 311 were dead, and 450 were prisoners. 6 men made it back to Allied lines. The Ranger battalions in Italy were effectively destroyed, and the surviving remnants were disbanded. The British commandos at Termoli had faced comparable odds, comparable terrain, and the same enemy. They held. The crucial difference was not courage. Both forces had that in abundance, but tactical philosophy, unit cohesion, and the quality of training that prepared men not merely for raids, but for sustained, grinding close combat defense. At Termoli, the commandos held off repeated infantry and armored counterattacks for 3 days until reinforcements from the 78th Division, including tanks from the County of London Yeomanry, stabilized the position. By the evening of October 6th, the Germans were in full retreat. The operation was a complete success. A deep water harbour captured, the German defensive line outflanked, and the 8th Army's advance secured. The price was not trivial. The Special Service Brigade suffered well over 500 casualties at Termoli, killed, wounded, and missing, across the 3 commando units and the SAS squadron. Number 40, Royal Marine Commando, bore a heavy share. But the unit remained combat effective. It absorbed its losses, integrated replacements through the same rigorous commando training pipeline, and was back in the line within weeks. The contrast with the American Rangers was acute and structural. Derby's force had expanded from 1 battalion to 3 in North Africa, but the expansion had diluted the original quality. Replacements often lacked the depth of training that the 1st Rangers had received at Achnacarry. By the time of Cisterna, many men in the 1st and 3rd battalions were relative novices, thrust into a mission that demanded the highest levels of night movement skill, tactical discipline, and fire control. The Rangers were, in essence, a provisional outfit grafted onto a conventional army that did not quite know what to do with them. The Royal Marine Commandos suffered from no such institutional ambiguity. They were Marines first and Commandos second, or, more accurately, they carried the identity and traditions of both simultaneously. The Royal Marines had been fighting from ships and shores since the reign of Charles II. Commando training refined and sharpened that tradition, but did not replace it. When losses occurred, the replacement pipeline fed men who had passed through the same Achnacarry course, who wore the same green beret, and who understood the same tactical vocabulary. Unit cohesion was not an aspiration, it was the baseline. The Fallschirmjäger noticed. German intelligence assessments from the Italian campaign consistently rated the British commandos, and the Royal Marine Commandos in particular, as among the most dangerous opponents they faced. The paratroopers respected the Americans' firepower and numbers, but they feared the commandos' willingness to fight at night, their proficiency in silent movement, and their alarming comfort with close-quarters battle. In the cramped villages, vine terraces, and river crossings of the Italian peninsula, these were the skills that decided who lived and who died. The wider political cost of the Italian campaign fell heavily on British shoulders. The Mediterranean strategy was Churchill's strategy, and every setback, Anzio's stalemate, the 4 bloody battles of Monte Cassino, the grinding slog up the peninsula, was ammunition for American critics who had argued all along that the whole enterprise was a waste of Allied manpower. Within the War Cabinet, there were moments of genuine doubt. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, confided to his diary the exhaustion of managing both the war and Churchill's relentless, sometimes quixotic, interventions. The Italian campaign consumed British divisions that might have been used elsewhere, strained the Empire's already overstretched manpower, and contributed to the slow, painful recognition that Britain was no longer the senior partner in the Western Alliance. Yet the men on the ground, the Marines of 40 and 43 Commando, the Army Commandos, the SAS, continued to fight with a ferocity that outstripped their numbers and their resources. The Fallschirmjäger would encounter them again and again over the following 18 months. The final, defining encounter came in April 1945, when the 2nd Commando Brigade was tasked with one of the most ambitious operations of the entire Italian campaign: the clearance of the Comacchio Lagoon in advance of the 8th Army's spring offensive. Operation Roast, launched on the night of April 1st, 1945, was a masterpiece of combined arms improvisation. The Comacchio Pocket, a sliver of flat, featureless land between the shallow, silted lagoon and the Adriatic, crisscrossed by canals, dikes, and minefields, was held by a mixed German garrison that included elements of the 162nd Turkoman Division and battle-hardened rear area troops. Brigadier Ronnie Todd's plan called for amphibious LVTs, fantails, to ferry Army Commandos across the lake flats while the Royal Marines of 40 and 43 Commando attacked overland along the narrow Tongue and Spit, corridors of sand and scrub barely wide enough for a company front. The operation nearly foundered at the start. The lake was unusually shallow after a dry spring, and the fantails bogged down in the mud. Soldiers were transferred to storm boats in scenes of considerable chaos, and the schedule slipped by hours. But Todd ordered the attack to continue, and at 5 o'clock in the morning of April 2nd, behind a barrage from over 100 Royal Artillery guns, the Commandos went in. It was during this advance, on April 3rd, that Corporal Thomas Peck, Hunter of C Troop 43, RM Commando, performed the act of selfless courage that earned the last Victoria Cross, awarded to a Royal Marine in the Second World War. Hunter, a 21-year-old former apprentice stationer from Edinburgh, saw that his troop was caught in the open with no cover, exposed to at least 9 Spandau machine guns and enemy mortars. He seized the Bren gun and charged alone across 200 yards of open ground, firing from the hip. 3 machine guns in the houses ahead opened up on him. 6 more from the far bank of the canal joined in. Hunter kept running. His charge so demoralized the Germans in the houses that 6 surrendered to him, and the rest fled. He then deliberately exposed himself as a target, lying on a rubble heap in full view of the enemy, firing at concrete pillboxes on the opposite bank to allow the rest of his troop to reach cover. He was finally killed by a burst of Spandau fire to the head. He had called only for more Bren magazines. In 3 days of fighting, the 2nd Commando Brigade captured 946 prisoners, destroyed 3 German battalions, 2 artillery troops, and a machine gun company. The Comacchio Spit was cleared. The flank of the 8th Army was secured. The diversionary effect drew German reserves away from the main thrust through the Argenta Gap, accelerating the collapse of the entire German position in northern Italy. The German surrender in Italy came on May 2nd, 1945. Lake Comacchio was the Royal Marines' last battle honour of the war. The significance was not lost on those who planned the post-war future. When the Labour government under Clement Attlee undertook the painful demobilisation and restructuring of Britain's armed forces after 1945, the Army Commandos were abolished. Churchill, their great champion, was out of office. A War Office study concluded that large commando forces were no longer required, but the Royal Marine Commandos were retained. The Green Beret passed permanently to the Corps, and the commando identity became the defining feature of the modern Royal Marines. A fusion of centuries-old amphibious expertise with the aggressive specialist training philosophy born at Achnacarry. The question posed by this video's title, why did German paratroopers dread fighting Royal Marines more than US Rangers, admits no simple, triumphalist answer. The Rangers were brave men, well led, who paid a terrible price for failures of intelligence and command that were not their fault. Derby himself was a superb officer who died in action in the final weeks of the war. The destruction at Cisterna was a tragedy, not a disgrace. But the operational record speaks for itself. The Royal Marine Commandos fought the Fallschirmjäger at Termoli on the Garigliano, at Anzio in the Adriatic Islands, in Albania, and at Lake Comacchio, and in every engagement they held their ground, achieved their objectives, or inflicted disproportionate damage on an enemy that considered itself the finest light infantry in Europe. The Rangers, by contrast, were effectively destroyed in a single catastrophic engagement and never reconstituted in the Italian theatre. The reasons were systemic, not personal. The commando training pipeline at Achnacarry produced soldiers of a consistently high standard. The institutional permanence of the Royal Marines meant that experience was retained, lessons were absorbed, and a culture of professional excellence was maintained across the long, grinding months of an attritional campaign. The tactical doctrine, rooted in amphibious flexibility, night fighting, close-quarter aggression, and the ability to hold ground without heavy support, was precisely calibrated for the kind of war that Italy demanded. The Fallschirmjäger themselves were, paradoxically, the best judges. They knew. They had fought every major Allied formation in Italy, from American conscript divisions to Indian and South African brigades, from Free French troops to the formidable Gurkhas. The Green Berets occupied a particular place in their professional estimation, not because they were supermen, but because they were consistently, relentlessly competent in the dark, close, ugly fighting where wars are actually decided. It is a story that deserves to be better known. In the popular imagination, the great elite unit narratives of the Second World War tend to be American. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the Marines at Iwo Jima. These are extraordinary stories, justly celebrated. But the Royal Marine Commandos wrote their own chapter in the same war, against the same caliber of enemy, in a theatre that has never received the attention it merits. From the rain-soaked assault courses of Achnacarry to the blood-red sunsets over the Adriatic, these men forged a reputation that shaped the identity of the Royal Marines for the next 80 years. And counting. Corporal Thomas Hunter's Victoria Cross, the last awarded to a Royal Marine in that war, now rests in the collection of the National Museum of the Royal Navy. His grave lies at Argenta Gap War Cemetery, beside that of Major Anders Lassen, Fief C of the Special Boat Service, who fell in the same action. 2 Victoria Crosses, 2 Allied nations, 1 battle. The legacy endures. If this story resonated with you, if it told you something you did not know about Britain's war in Italy, then do leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. I would be particularly interested to hear your views. Was the Italian campaign a strategic sideshow, or a necessary front that shaped the outcome of the war? Let me know. Until next time.